Hello, and thank you for taking the time to watch this webinar on adopting computer software assurance for validation computer systems. My name is Kevin Bogert, managing member of Azimuth Compliance Consulting. Here's a brief bio of myself. I have over 30 years of business experience in the life science sector where I had the responsibility for implementing quality, manufacturing, and regulatory systems for major pharmaceutical, biotech, and medical device companies. Most of my experience has been working with companies and suppliers related to regulatory remediation and quality system modernization, including improving how companies approach validation projects. As we will see in this presentation, the FDA is encouraging companies to move beyond their document-centric validation model to a more modern critical thinking process that can greatly reduce the amount of documentation generated while minimizing risk associated with patient safety, product quality, and data integrity. Let's look at an overall objective of what you will get out of this presentation. First, I will look at how computer software assurance following an agile methodology greatly reduces documentation and lowers risk. Next, how critical thinking fits into computer software assurance model. How the role of validation team will change when you implement computer software assurance. And finally, the changing role of the supplier quality auditor and business owner when it comes to qualifying a software vendor. I'm going to spend some time on this first slide just to set the groundwork for what will be covered on future slides. I will mention Agile throughout this webinar as is a basis of computer software assurance. When we mention people, we are talking about the typical validation team. This is what I see the team possibly consisting of and their role in validation. Validation engineers who may be tasked with writing automated test scripts in addition to writing typical scripted test cases that we are all used to. The supplier auditor, along with the business owner, will be responsible for assessing what is usable from the supplier to reduce verification and validation testing, basically accepting their testing as your OQ. The quality representative will have less documentation review, but will need to ensure the high-risk items were properly tested and documented. IT provides the project management and technical piece of the puzzle. IT may be tasked with writing automated test scripts in absence of a validation engineer, or helping the validation engineer on their first 1 or 2 projects in writing these automated test scripts. The business owner will have the responsibility for writing user stories and the acceptance criteria associated with each story as they are developed. This is a big change from the current validation model where they write their user requirements and are then later in the process writing test scripts around those requirements. A lot more paperwork, a lot later in the process compared to what computer software assurance requires. Modernization of validation can be applied to 3 areas of the medical device organization. The validation of COD software, custom built software by internal teams, and medical device software. What I mean by medical device software is software as a medical device, software in a medical device, and software used for manufacturing and maintenance of medical device. What we have found is that using 100% agile methodology for COTS validation can greatly reduce the time and cost of implementation, validation, and maintenance of software in a validated state compared to the current computer software validation model presented by GAMP. If your IT organization develops internal software or use an external company, adopting an agile methodology can increase overall quality of the software while reducing the time to deliver the validated solution to the user. Deliverables are measured in weeks, not months, at a lower cost to the organization. The process starts in the beginning of the development process and is ongoing throughout its life cycle. You don't wait till after the development to start your validation. It becomes part of the process, not after development thought process. Build quality into the process by combining the development and validation as one and the same, not as a separate piece of the project. Take advantage of the testing performed by the development team to ensure that those items typically tested in OQ are included as part of the software testing. An example would be verification of calculation, the upper or lower limits of valid fields, or values of fields, or if fields are required or not. These do not belong in validation because they are verification steps and they belong in software testing. Typically, I find that a lot of companies include these in their OQ testing. It is unnecessary. It should be part of software testing conducted by the vendor or the development team. If you develop software as a medical device, software in a medical device, and software used for manufacture and maintenance of a medical device, all regulatory requirements can be met using an Agile methodology for both development and validation, with less documentation and better results. Just an FYI, Agile development has been used in the medical device industry for many years, not just for validation. It's new for validation, but it's been in the area since 2012 when the AAMI standard TI 45 was provided to medical device companies as a guidance and recommendation for complying with internal standards or international standards and FDA guidance documents when using Agile practices to develop medical device software. Use this as your basis for applying an Agile methodology to validation. You will see in the upcoming release of GAMP later this year, the adoption of Agile as a methodology for the validation of software. Technology is critical to the automating, managing, and documenting the validation of software. Computer software assurance guidance document will encourage the use of automated testing tools and unscripted test scripts. This does not mean not documenting, but documenting what adds value to an organization, not to an auditor. Look at your IT group for assistance as to what tools you can use to better automate, manage, and document your validation projects. When adopting a new process, cultural change may be necessary. Without addressing the underlying cultural challenges, most computer software validation to computer software assurance modernization efforts will have limited success. We have found over the past few years that companies starting the process will end with a hybrid model or completely cancel the modernization effort. They will fall back to what they're more comfortable with, which is a Gantt model, document everything, create a lot of documentation that is unnecessary, and so forth. Streamlining the process is the only way to do it, and using a more agile model will help greatly. So let me give you two examples of companies that have adopted the Agile for validation methodology. First, we worked with a large medical device company on the West Coast. They came to us with this exact problem. They used Agile for development and the Gantt methodology for the validation step. Senior management wanted to have software delivered in weeks, but with the current model, it was taking months, not weeks, to complete the validation effort. They finished their development and started the validation effort, following the current Gantt model for validation. When they moved to Agile for both development and validation, they finished the validation effort nearly the same time as the development and testing. The result was delivering a product in weeks, not months, fully validated, and meeting the needs of senior management. The same model worked with a biotech company. They were implementing GAMP, Category 4 software, and the volume and documentation testing took them 3 to 4 months to complete, with hundreds of pages of documentation. Their test scripts averaged over 100 pages and created a lot of documentation and screen prints. Their focus was capturing screenshots in most test steps. They switched to an Agile methodology on the next project for validation with a limited number of tests or screenshots, and finished the validation 2 days after the final configuration with less documentation and better results. The combined test scripts for OQ and PQ were under 30 pages, and the final documentation was less than 100 pages, including the test scripts. The focus of testing was on high-risk items. Review and approval took less than an hour after completion of the validation effort, as was an ongoing process rather than waiting until the end when everything was finished. The point I want to make with these examples is it provides to you shorten your validation effort and documentation without compromising quality. My model, 30 pages versus 30 binders, equals better results. Focus on high-risk items with limited amount of documentation, and you will create better results with a higher confidence level that the system meets its intended use and complies with the predicate rules and Part 11 requirements. Your biggest challenge will be the cultural change required to successfully move from the CSV model to the CSA adopted model by the FDA. So let's talk about the difference between computer software validation and computer software assurance. CSV takes the approach of creating elaborate documentation which ensures auditors have a detailed overview of each aspect of the application being used for manufacturing the product. Your validation has everything with detailed test scripts that require screenshots as proof of execution. The focus is documentation. Drawback is you miss the high-risk areas because you focus on everything. The current computer software validation methodology has a life science company spending 80% of their time documenting the process and only 20% of the time testing the efficacy of the software. This approach lacks speed and flexibility, ignores previous assurance activities or risk controls. You spend more time on verification versus validation, whereas the computer software assurance or CSA represents a step change in computer system validation, placing critical thinking at the center of this validation process, as opposed to the traditional one-size-fits-all approach. Focus on testing for high confidence in system performance, applying the right level of rigor to establish fitness for use for given risk to patient safety process and or data integrity. The FDA initiated the CSA or computer software assurance guidelines so that 80% of life science companies spend time on critical thinking and testing and only 20% of the time in documentation. Implying CSA, more time is spent on testing of high-risk requirements and less on verification. Verification is the focus of the supplier audit process and responsibility of the software vendor. Whereas in the validation or CSV model, verification is incorporated into the OQ. Verification of items previously tested by the vendor that are low risk to the organization and little relationship to the intended usage of the system or predicate rules are ignored, or not ignored, but are low priority, low risk items and used as part of unscripted testing process used in the life science industry. As we see, there's a lot of documentation that must be created before validation can start. The result is a very inefficient process that creates a lot of documentation, but little proof that high-risk items were tested. CSV is more concerned about the volume of documentation and screenshots versus what was tested. Let's compare the difference between an agile and waterfall approach to documenting validation effort. The graph on the left shows creating documentation as late as possible model versus maintaining documentation as you go model shown on the right. The key is to both graphs is the difference in the amount of documentation created following a computer software assurance model versus CSV. My preference is to use a document as you go model on the right hand side. It requires that you maintain the documentation as you work through the process rather than waiting until all decisions have been made by the team, then documenting your decisions. Some people say this approach requires more time commitment due to the ongoing maintenance of the documentation. My experience actually shows the opposite. So what is CSA or computer software assurance? Over the next few slides, I will discuss what does CSA prescribe and advocate, how CSA aligns to 21 CFR Part 11, its principles and focus, and the importance of data integrity. This slide shows a comparison from the FDA of CSV versus CSA. We look at the CSV, we see that the FDA considers the current model as a focus on creating documentation for compliance, validating everything, thus missing critical high-risk items. Lack of speed and flexibility ignores what has been done by the vendor or developer. Whereas FDA views CSA as testing rather than documentation. More focus on high-risk items. Use what has previously been performed by the vendor or developer. Much more flexibility and easier to maintain. In the FDA's view, the benefit of technology in improving quality and safety for patients far exceeds the risk of technology and the perceived value provided by the documentation/time burden of current validation process. If you take one thing from this slide, is the FDA is focused on testing rather than documentation, based on the risk to patient safety, process, and data integrity. So let's look at the scope of the CSA document, guidance document. FDA's focus goes back to the key risk factors of patient safety, process or product quality, and data integrity, and the intended usage of the system. They are not concerned with infrastructure, hardware, or general business processes. CSA requires that you evaluate the regulated and non-regulated business processes. When creating the data flows, you can determine when and where in the process the human interaction will be required, the intended use, and the level of risk associated with this interaction, and in relationship to the predicate rules in determining risk. To leverage those activities performed by the supplier, you must understand how you will use the system and what are the acceptance criteria related to the usage. In the Agile model, these are captured in user stories. They include a sentence or two, and more important, a series of conversations about the desired functionality and what is acceptable, its intended use. Knowing this information, you can assess the supplier's documentation to determine what is usable from the supplier and what must be tested by the team. The FDA stresses the importance of supplier-provided documentation. This becomes your OQ if properly assessed during the audit. With this knowledge, you can determine the controls to be put in place, the testing techniques to use, what tools will help you with your validation activities, the benefits of Agile, and an ongoing monitoring of the existing and new risks identified when new releases is provided by the vendor. Do I need to perform a follow-up audit based on these risks? What additional validation is required? These are questions you want to ask yourself. The next few slides are from a presentation given at Annual Society of Quality Assurance in April of this year. The CSA approach is broken down into 4 parts. Intended use. How do I plan on using the software? Evaluating the risk. Identify the failure will result in a higher product or process risk. Assurance. Ensure that you identify high-risk features, operations, or functions. Reliability. Perform as intended. And records. Develop the least burdensome record of assurance. Do not focus on documentation, rather focus on high-risk items. So let's look at each one of these. First thing you must do in your CSA process is identify the intended use of the system. The FDA considers intended use to be the software that is used as part of the product or production of the quality system. Focus on features, functions, and operations used. Infrastructure and general business processes are not in scope of 820.70i or 1. Any other system or software is considered low risk and does not need to be validated. These include the software used to write automated test scripts as an example. I remember companies validating compilers and report writers, printing out 30 samples of labels, or printing the first and last 10 pages of a report. Even now, many companies purchase software packages from vendors and execute them. Weeks later, and many binders full of paper prove very little in verification and intended use of the system. I'm still asked by many companies if I have a set of user requirements they can use. My answer is, why did you buy the system? What is a predicate rule? What predicate rule applies? That is your starting point and critical to the CSA model. You must know your intended use and your acceptance criteria around the intended use. Evaluate risk is your next step in the process. You should identify if a feature, operation, or function results in a product or process risk. Product risk refers to the potential for a device to harm a patient, so patient safety risk. Process risk refers to the potential to compromise production or quality system, product quality or data integrity risk. I see in many validation efforts that the testing is focused on automated routing, tracking, change control management, and procedure management. Manage data, automated and existing calculation, increase process monitoring, and provide exception alerts. Support related items like maintenance tables and workflows not directly related to high-risk items. Your validation effort should be based on the risk of the feature, function, operations as it relates to your intended use. High process risk is a primary concern for the FDA. It should be the focus in your validation of software. Avoid compounding your effort with broader process risk. Focus your testing on high-risk items. Not everything is high risk. Your guidance Next, determine your assurance approach to the system. Identify the high-risk features, operations, or functions of the solution performed as intended. You should leverage existing activities and supplier data, process controls to mitigate risk, use of agile testing methodology and non-scripted testing. Use electronic data capture and record creation. Leverage continuous data information for monitoring and assurance. Determine test methods based on risk. Scripted and unscripted. Scripted testing is used for high-risk items. All other items can be tested using unscripted and automated testing. Remember, unscripted or automated testing does not mean undocumented. A comprehensive assurance approach leverages established business process and prior work performed by the vendor. I believe this is one of the most important slides I will be showing you. Finally, establish appropriate records. Least burdensome record of assurance activities that consider intended use. What needs to be assured. Determination of features, operations, functions impact the risk level. Identify insurance needs. And capture to demonstrate acceptance of results, not that of the auditor. The records need to be of value to the organization, not the auditor. Leverage capabilities of the system. Screenshots are not necessary. Only use if they add value to the organization. But what is very important is, this is a slide from the FDA. They're saying your documentation of assurance activities conducted include description of the test conducted based on assurance activity, issues found if there are any, and their disposition, conclusion statement declaring acceptance of results, the name of the person who conducted the test and the date of testing, and finally, establish review and approval where appropriate. When necessary, a signature of that individual with statutory authority to approve the record. Nowhere do they say you should have screenshots, printout reports, and other things that create a lot of paperwork. Their focus is, as with other kind of testing done in the pharmaceutical industry, where you can't get screenshots, is to document what happened. If there's issues, correct those issues, can come up with a resolution, and then write your conclusion statement and sign and date, and then have someone else review that you did this. Not create a lot of unnecessary documentation that adds no value to your organization. Why did I say the ineffective approach to 21 CFR Part 11? The reason goes back to the initial purpose of Part 11. It was the creation of audit trail and electronic signature records as it related to the predicate rule. Where industry went wrong is the rule was applied to everything in an automated system. All testing required a proof of audit record creation, and in some cases that electronic signatures were being captured every time a record was changed. Screen prints were captured for everything, and the audit records were then printed and compared against the screen prints to verify results. The level of risk based on intended use and predicate rule was ignored because the focus was on testing everything, no matter the risk, and creating documented proof of testing and audit trails. This was not the purpose of 21 CFR Part 11. This is not a risk-based approach to validation. This is software testing that should be verified as part of the vendor audit and not the focus of validation. Focus on the predicate rule to ensure the audit records match what was entered or changed, and if an electronic system signature is required based on predicate rule, it meets the requirements of 21 CFR Part 11. So it comes down to critical thinking and the focus on what are the high versus low risk functionality. Here's an example. If we write a document for review, we don't require a signature or audit event, as this is an ongoing process. The document will be checked in and out and modified many times during this process. When a document is to be routed for final approval, then this part falls under the predicate rules and must be validated. All that is required for validation is capturing an audit event around the approval signatures. This should be handled by scripted testing as it is high risk item. All other testing is verification of the system that can be included as part of the testing performed by the vendor and verification or verified as part of the audit or handled as part of an unscripted testing. Remember, unscripted does not mean undocumented. When a team focuses on high risk items And where the human interaction occurs, the focus on validation is on quality or critical thinking versus documentation. You create 30 pages versus 30 binders. Following a CSA model, the detection of critical system failures is earlier than traditional validation. What is appropriate testing? This is determined by the risk level of the functionality and its relationship to the predicate rule in Part 11. The use of scripted versus unscripted testing is required based on risk. With CSA, or computer software assurance, following a more agile approach to testing, peer review is a critical component of this methodology. Quality's role is a final review to ensure that all scripted testing was completed based on the associated risk of the item, not if screen prints were captured. It all comes down to limiting documentation by improving testing, thus improving quality. Agile's focus is early failure detection and resolution, a continuous improvement model where the team learns from each failure detected and how to do better testing in the future. First, critical thinking. Knowing that testing needs to focus on high-risk approach that includes the three key factors of patient safety, product quality, and data integrity. The predicate rules, 21 CF Part 11, and the intended use of the system. Second, separate verification from validation. Take advantage of what was performed by the software vendor or developer. Use automated and unscripted testing of low to medium risk items. Focus scripting testing on high-risk items based on critical thinking process. Move to auditing of supplier versus qualifying. This can only be done when you know what is acceptable of each requirement. You cannot determine this using waterfall methodology or GAM, as this information is not known until scripts are being written. User stories, an agile approach, requires that you document what are the expected results, or more specific, what is acceptable to the user. One thing to remember, based on Annex 11, your IT group should be considered a supplier if they are developing software for your organization. They should be audited the same as any other vendor. The testing they perform should be used to determine the level of your validation effort. The type of testing used is based on associated risk and of intended use. Using unscripted and automated testing versus testing everything, or everything being scripted, allows for the team to focus on high-risk items. The key is more holistic approach to validation, including what was performed by the supplier. If a vendor or software developer did their testing following a well-documented process, your focus is not on writing what they did, but focus on what testing you do on high-risk items. The key is the PQ versus the OQ, a big change from the CSV model. Data integrity requires that you understand the intended use of the system, that you focus on regulated versus unregulated functionality with respect to patient safety, product quality, and data integrity, with a tailored approach to each system versus a one approach to all. CSA, or computer software assurance, is very much aligned with an agile model. You break validation into work cycles, which are called sprints. Each sprint has its own agreed upon deliverable. The benefit is issues are discovered much earlier in the process as the focus is on smaller parts versus the whole. Checks are conducted at the end of each sprint. The critical piece is stakeholder involvement throughout the process. You meet with the stakeholders much more often, allowing issues to be resolved early in the process, and a better understanding of the expected results of each requirement. It is a team approach to validation. Documentation review is an ongoing process versus waiting to the end. The key is the timeline for deliverable systems, fully validated and measured in weeks versus months at a lower cost to the organization. Let's look at a typical validation process, or what it looks like compared to CSA. In this slide, we see that CSV is more of a plan-driven process, in that there is only one start and one finish point. CSA, or computer software assurance, using an agile model, has more of a value-driven process, with many points where the process is completed before the next one starts. But the planning begins for the next sprint prior to the completion of the current sprint. For the primary stakeholder, this means they are getting a validated system with additional capabilities being introduced at pretty different phases of the life cycle. The value is the use of the system much earlier at a lower cost with a higher level of assurance that the system meets intended use versus focus on documentation. I discussed a lot about what is CSA and Agile. Now it's time to look at how an organization aligns to this model. How do you align with Agile? Agile is a team-focused approach. Teams are more empowered to deliver a quality product when they have more autonomy and accountability based on the decisions they make. The team's focus is on outcomes. What is the best interest of the business, not an auditor? Let me give you an example. I worked with this large medical device company. They had a failure in their testing. Very early on, quality says it was due to they didn't understand the validation. They didn't test everything. My argument was they didn't understand what they needed in the first place, what their intended use was, how that should work, what was acceptable to them. Thus, their root cause was it was a validation failure, and mine was it wasn't a validation failure. It was further back. It was a business decision or intended usage failure. They did not test high-risk items because they didn't know what was high risk. They did not well define what was expected. For instance, did it delete records, or was it supposed to delete records? This was a failure point. It was deleting records when it shouldn't have, but that was not one of the requirements, so it wasn't tested because nobody asked the question. Nobody did the critical thinking up front to determine what was important. So teams can quickly adjust to these changes, and failures are part of a continuous improvement process. In this case, they could have gone back and improved how they wrote their test scripts, but more important, how they defined their requirements and what was acceptable. The team learns from these failures and makes the necessary changes to prevent occurrence of these identified issues. What does this provide to the organization? Value in one word. You get a system that's been better tested, less documentation to review, and delivered quicker. So, who are these stakeholders? It is middle management. They are the linchpin between the executive's vision and the team's ability to apply an agile computer software assurance model. This requires a shift in a typical management model away from the top-down approach. CSA requires a shift away from documentation to digitalization. The new validation effort should leverage software development methodology and tools to be successful. More and more IT organizations are shifting to an agile development and documentation model. Validation must support this transformation effort by adopting similar processes and tools. We see companies that try to use both, and the bottleneck is always the validation effort when the waterfall model or GAMP is used, rather than an agile CSA model. A question: why have organizations shown a reluctancy to adopt a risk-based testing of programs? What we have found is a fear that a low to medium risk items will not be properly tested and documented based on existing CSV or computer software validation process, as it is incomplete. This leads to the next question: why are uniform testing approaches more comfortable? The quality unit believes that the more documentation is better. Any questions arise when they do not see proof of testing, such as screen prints. They question the overall validation effort. If you're using, or if you were to use a risk-based testing approach, what could be some of the cost, time savings realized? Well, quicker delivery of a product with a higher probability that critical items have been thoroughly tested. Our experience has been that companies typically purchase software, then wait 3 to 6 months or longer until they can use it. Many blame validation as a reason for delay. I would disagree with this reasoning. It is the process of implementation, which validation is part of, to blame for many of the delays. What I recall is companies go through the implementation process, then they say, we need to do the validation of the system. Right there, it shows you there is a process problem. And the validation and quality departments are the fall guys for bad processes. Implementation and validation are treated as 2 different projects, when in fact it should be one. What needs to be considered? A dialogue with your quality partners. Trust must be established that you perform testing without creating unnecessary documentation. They must or must feel comfortable that you have tested the system without proof of screenshots. What needs to be, who needs to be on board? Primary stakeholder or sponsor, quality, compliance, technology owner, business owner. What tools can help your organization be successful? You should start small and build your tool chest as you go. Look at what IT is using. Tools will need to be replaced as you move through the process as your validation and testing maturity module progresses towards a more CSA model. Understand where you are in the maturity model and use what tools is important to your success. Here are some of the tools we use when assessing where an organization is in the process of adopting CSA versus or as an agile model. Validation maturity model. How do you compare to other companies in the industry? Where are they in adopting CSA? Your testing maturity model. Are you still using a lot of scripted testing versus a hybrid of scripted and unscripted and automated? Automated maturity model. Are you using a lot of tools for testing and project management? And validation. What you need to do is conduct interviews and surveys and workshops around your maturity process. Your testing, your automation, your validation, how are these being accepted by your organization? Do you all speak the same words? Finally, use something like SWOT. Understand your strengths and your weaknesses, where the opportunities are and where the threats are to your success. I'd like to thank you for watching this recorded webinar. Please sign up for upcoming webinars on our website related to supplier quality or other webinars we will be offering in the future or what we have offered in the past. If you would like to discuss the concepts I discussed during this webinar and how best to approach your monetization effort, please feel free to contact us and we will set up a time to discuss the topic and present in this webinar and how we can help you transition to a CSA Agile model. At this point, I would like to thank you for attending this webinar and have a nice day.